Oh, it's so good to see familiar faces, including some folks I haven't seen in a while. Hey, everyone. All right, well, as you're getting up and going, I'm just thrilled to see you guys joining us today. Please use that Zoom chat box. We have folks joining us from all over the place, and I just love to know, so we're not together in person, where you're joining us from. And just so, well, yeah, this is great. Yeah, let us know where you're joining us from. For those who I haven't met, I think I'm going to know pretty much everyone here, but my name is Terry Babcock-Loomish. I serve as the Executive Secretary of the Truman Foundation and CEO of Friends of Truman. As a reminder, Friends is our nonprofit partner of the Truman Foundation, America's living memorial to President Truman, and our national monument to public service. My goodness, I've just had so much underway this spring. Before we get started, I want to give as much room to this conversation as possible, but I think it's only proper that I thank everyone who have called and written your elected officials, expressing support to Congress for recapitalization of the Truman Trust. Thank you so much for all of your great work. I also want to welcome our newest Truman Scholars, some of whom join us today even before next week's Truman Scholars Leadership Week. So welcome to our 21 scholars. We're thrilled to have you as part of our true fam. Many of you have also contributed to Friends of the Truman Foundation in honor of our class of 2021, which is so kind and such a warm welcome. So thank you for that. So let's go ahead and turn our attention to the topic at hand. I genuinely wish today's conversation on police reform weren't so timely and relevant and just frankly utterly necessary, but our nation is at a moment of reckoning over the role of power, the very role, the responsibilities of law enforcement. And today we all know the names of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner, Elijah McClain, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Ronald Green now, and so very many more. And last month, as people celebrate on the streets of Minneapolis, as a judge read guilty verdicts in the Derek Chauvin trial, we also saw in the following days the U.S. Justice Department announcing it would investigate whether police departments in both Minneapolis and Louisville engage in patterns of discrimination or excessive force. So we are seeing so much churning. And today we'll have that conversation, but we'll also really discuss how the law and our current institutions marginalize groups, and ultimately how our legal institutions might do better to support social cohesion. So we're going to have the experts really with us today. A Truman Scholar who does so very much to inspire and mentor, as well as to help select Truman Scholars state by state, year on year. Our 2002 South Carolina Truman, Monica Bell, is a professor of both law and sociology at Yale. Over the next year, Dr. Bell will be a visiting scholar at the Russell Sage Foundation, so much to watch for from Professor Bell for sure, as always. Joining her in conversation is our 2012 New Jersey Truman, Walter Fortson, currently in Willow Grove, Pennsylvania. He studied criminology at Cambridge upon graduation from Rutgers. For many years in multiple states, we know Walter has worked with organizations addressing the needs of incarcerated and other justice-involved people. Leading our conversation is our 2017 New Mexico Truman Scholar, Melina Simard-Holm, who also earned her master's in criminology at Cambridge and is now a student of Dr. Bell's at Yale Law. So before we return the conversation to them, let me remind you that we'll have time for Q&A today. So don't be shy, go ahead and put your questions in that Zoom chat, and then Melina will get to them after a little bit. So with that, thanks so much for being with us. Melina, let me turn this over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Babcock-Loomish, for your introduction, and Friends for hosting this. And thank you all so much for joining us today for this very urgent conversation about the crisis of policing in America. We are so lucky to have two extraordinary thinkers here with us guiding the conversation. Monica and Walter have committed themselves to transforming policing as we know it, and I've had the privilege to know that in my own scholarship through my work with Dr. Bell and also with my conversations with Walter. So I'm very excited and we have a lot to talk about. So I guess we'll start with a diagnostic question. I'd like to know what you all think about what is the crisis in policing specifically, and how did we get to this point? And Walter, if you want to start.
Thank you, Melina. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending. It's such an honor to be here and have this relevant and urgent discussion today. And so to jump right into the question, the crisis in policing is one that, unfortunately isn't a new one. Instead, it's more prominent and more relevant and salient because of how connected we are these days, how fast the internet works, the fact that everybody can pull out a video camera and record instantly and upload and have that video spread in a matter of seconds. Additionally, what we're seeing is an instance where people are having a vicarious experience when they watch videos and see what police do in certain communities to certain groups of people. And largely that experience is something that other people from other communities do not experience. And so I think awareness of the crisis, awareness of the longstanding crisis is what's happening right now. And kind of uniquely, we're at a point now where the last resident of the White House was such a polarizing person that he drew a line in the sand and he forced people to pick sides. Being a quote unquote supporter of the last resident in the White House came with many implications that there were a lot of people who just weren't comfortable being associated with. And I think that amongst other things, has led to this kind of national awakening and global awareness and a reckoning that has allowed conversations that have been happening for years and years, and even, decades, if we're being honest, to really be pushed to the forefront and addressed in a way that we've never seen before.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. And thanks for the question. And also thanks to all of you for showing up. It's so wonderful to see a lot of you here, even though the topic itself is somber. So I'm just gonna add on a bit to what Walter was saying about the kind of the new knowledge as opposed to the new reality of the policing crisis. So I think it's become increasingly known, really in the past year. So people are having a lot more conversations about how deep the fix is in policing. So, we've proceeded on pathways of police reform for essentially more than a century. There have been efforts to reform the police, basically since the police started in kind of formal organizations in the mid-19th century. There were efforts to change corruption and all of these things, but the conversations about racial injustice in policing have not, for the most part, been deeply historical, have not examined the roots of policing and the structural dynamics of policing as a fundamental feature. And so that means that a lot of the reform efforts that have been embarked upon have been about trying to make policing work better without really understanding how deep the fix is. So let me say a little bit more about what the nature of the fix is. So, more and more people now are talking about the origins of policing in kind of two primary locations. So before the formal organization of police forces in the mid-19th century, there were slave patrols, throughout the South that, in many ways kind of formed the roots of American policing. And it's important to note that although that is almost now a truism in conversations about police reform and police transformation, that research on the linkages between slave patrols and policing have existed for decades, right? So people have been laying this groundwork, doing this research. But then also in the mid-19th century, when formal police departments were created in urban centers, they largely focused to put down labor efforts. So there's this, and particularly, the work of unions, et cetera, so labor organizing. And all of this really shows that the basic purposes and kind of the organizational logics of policing are about crime control, and really over the past 30 years have also become crime prevention. Just to point out that, in the mid 1990s, people, like scholars, didn't actually even believe that police could prevent crime. So this idea of like police preventing crime is historically new. Maybe not the idea, but the idea that it was possible. So this is all to say, and I want to be brief, but also want to be fairly comprehensive. So in those roots of slave patrols, labor policing, and concerns about corruption within police forces, police departments embarked, really starting in the early 20th century, on a pathway, kind of a progressive era pathway of professionalism. And so there's been this pathway through which policing has expanded. So there are now more than 18,000 police departments across the US. At the same time, there's been this goal of professionalism that has meant that our courts and our legislators and political actors have become increasingly deferential to the claims of police leaders about what's necessary. So this is how you see, demands for militarization and kind of conversations about what type of force is justified really has fallen into the hands of police. And that is a part of a deliberate organizational effort throughout the 20th century. And finally, I just want to quickly mention changes in policing over the past 30 years or so, or maybe we won't say 40, toward what people call broken windows policing, or sometimes proactive policing, or community policing. The names have there are a lot of different names. We can talk about, more like specifically what if anything, those mean. But this is to say that particularly in predominantly Black communities in urban areas in the mid 70s and 80s, and so there was kind of this expansion of specialized, gang and narcotic units in particular areas, but the kind of, police just being there, the community policing, so to speak, this constant presence of police not doing anything particular, that was not really a part of the landscape of policing in the way that it started to be in the late 1980s and early 1990s. So this is all to say that there have been so many changes in policing theories and practices over the years, but none of those changes have gotten to the roots that I started talking about, which is this kind of deeply historical, multifunctional role of policing that has not been about crime control, and certainly has not been about crime prevention, as much as it has been about the control of socially disfavored populations.
Walter, do you want to go ahead if you have something?
Oh yeah, I mean, well, as Dr. Bell mentioned, she was very comprehensive and she covered a lot of the bases. But it just to go back to what she was explaining about the disconnect between the origins and the current state of policing and the theories that are used. One of the things that is most important, I think, and is a part of that disconnect is amongst different communities is, the idea of what police are there to do and their roles in society. And, we have, I believe there were at least 2 Supreme Court cases that essentially ruled that police have no duty to protect. They have no duty to protect people. And oftentimes what we see is there is a stark difference in the way that Black people understand police and Black people's interactions with police and then white people's interactions with police. And I lost my train of thought here. I'm sorry. Could you come back to me? I'm sorry. I lost my train of thought.
A question I have, I guess, that's following up on what you've been saying is the relationship of specific communities, particularly poor communities of color, to the police has been destroyed, but it also has already been destroyed before. And I guess I wonder if you all could speak to, I know, Monica, you've written about legal estrangement and the idea of exclusion from other frameworks. And is the crisis now is a result of this structural background, or is there something new due to these new forces of militarization and these new forms of social control that make this moment different? And this goes to what you were saying, Walter, about the ways that certain communities do not feel protected by the police.
I guess I'm just going to jump in there quickly to say, yes, it's not, the crisis is not just about history. The crisis is also, and this, Walter was talking about this vicarious experience. Like I've interviewed many people, many Black people about their experiences with the police. I also have my own personal experiences, but talking about from a research vantage point right now, the people, people love to do like a gender thing with policing. It's like, oh, well, men experience policing and, other people don't, this kind of thing. But that's not true. And it's not true on multiple levels. But one of the levels I think is really important here is that people often tell stories about not their own personal experiences with the police, but the experiences of other people, like their family members, their friends, that people in their community. And also there's a kind of collective memory, to use sociological language of police violence. And I use the term violence really broadly. That's like, I'm writing about that right now. There's a collective memory that is passed along in the sense that people tell stories to each other about their racist experiences with police. And so this is to say that there is a lot of effort on kind of changing individual interactions with police. So this is like procedural justice training and implicit bias training and all the trainings and the trainings and the trainings. And that's fine and well, but the crisis isn't just about those direct individual interactions. Is the deep collective experience that produces these senses of social exclusion along multiple levels. And that's part of the fix too. And it's really hard to think about how law and policy can address those types of, well, I should say law and policy that's like limited traditional police reforms, how they can address those types of that deep estrangement.
Yeah, speaking of these reforms, I think it'd be interesting to think about a lot of national and local attempts to reform the police. And, a lot of these initiatives, the attempts to change qualified immunity, to reform police unions, mandate body cams. There's federal legislation now, the George Floyd Act. They've been criticized for not doing enough because they don't really sometimes address the full structural scope of the issue. But I guess I was wondering if you think these reforms can be non-reformist in some senses, and what the limits and potentials of these sorts of reforms are.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I had a little brain fog there, but I got it back though. And so I can actually tie what I was going to say into the question that you just asked. And so what I was trying to say earlier is that the public discourse and the public opinion has often been the largest roadblock to any type of structural or systemic reforms of policing because of the different interactions and experiences people have. And the fact that we as kind of like one body can't really agree on what the role of police is. In so many different levels, at so many different levels and from different standpoints. And so oftentimes, like I said, alluded to with the Supreme Court ruling that police actually have no duty to protect, but they're, groups of people who feel like, oh, the police absolutely protect me. We need them. We need them here to stop crime. We need them here to stop the bad guys. And then there are people that feel like I was never the bad guy. but I was always seen as the bad guy. And so that's the problem. And I think that when we talk about reform, there are a lot of people who experience police violence, who don't have the voice to really guide the discussions on reform. And then there are a lot of, then there's another group of people who are in those positions of power, but they don't have that experience or that collective memory to really hone in on what the root causes are and connect those to the current and actual problems. And I think a lot of those reforms fall flat. Like one of the biggest reforms that came out, I believe after Michael Brown was killed, or in that time period, was this whole body camera thing. Body cams are going to change the game. Body cams will stop all of this. And, you know, there are a lot of people who knew that wasn't the answer. But the power and the ability and the access to bring that to the forefront, the people who are most affected by the police don't have the power to bring that argument to the forefront and have it heard by people who are actually change makers, who can actually advance those ideas and get those policies and legislation passed. And the debate for me is whether or not something like that is intentional. I believe that it is intentional to stop those things from getting to the forefront because, as again, going back to what Dr. Bell was saying, there's a disconnect between the origins of policing and the modern day crisis and how we got there. And so oftentimes these reforms are not addressing the root causes. They're addressing symptoms of a much, much larger problem.
Yeah, I want to jump in here. I will say, I live in a state of brain fog. So Walter, like, I hear you. And everyone, please stop calling me Dr. Bill. That's awkward. Anyway, so a couple of things I want to pick up on that Walter was saying. So one of them is, and this, Leah, your question is about, whether some of the incremental sorts of reforms, and maybe they seem like big reforms, but some of these reforms that you've talked about, or issues that you talked about, can be non-reformist, or can they actually lead toward transformational or perhaps abolitionist change? And I think what Walter was saying is part of the answer, which is, actually, maybe some of them could be but the question is all about who's advocating for them and who has power in the conversation. So we have to talk about process a lot when thinking about what good policy. We have a tendency, especially in Truman spaces, to be like, well, what is the policy? And it's like, well, let's step back for a second and ask about process and power. Who has the power to influence outcomes? And it may well be that many people who are directly affected by police violence would sign on to some of the, reforms, maybe not body cameras. That one's interesting, and we can say a little bit more about that perhaps, but would sign on to some reforms that seem reformist, like data collection, for example. I think data collection is really important, but sometimes people throw up data collection as a way of not doing anything transformative. So there's this really kind of complex politics around it. Well, if marginalized people have access to the data to push forward real change, then maybe that can be non-reformist. But in order for that to be true, the power structure, the governance of whatever it is we have has to radically shift. I want to say one point in this conversation related to, I'm just kind of jumping ahead, like Autumn placed a great question in the chat about the AFL-CIO and organized labor. And as I think we probably, many of us know at this point, police unions are one of the key obstructionist features of any type of bold reform, even reform that may be less bold. Like, this whole debate about qualified immunity, qualified immunity is a problem but much of the violence that people experience, even if there weren't qualified immunity, would not give rise to a civil rights lawsuit. So it's kind of like, qualified immunity is not going to get us to the end point of a radically transformed society and criminal system. But even some of those, like, unions are really, really opposed to them. And so, frankly, I think one thing that organized labor can do, so I know the Fraternal Order of Police and a lot of the police unions aren't affiliated with the AFL, but some locals are. And frankly, I think they should be expelled. Police unions are not the same as other types of worker unions. And I think that the organized labor community is starting to have a real reckoning about its complicity, historically in a lot of racism, but also more contemporarily with by embracing all worker, basically like failing to see how not all worker concerns are equal. So I think actually being clear about that. The one other thing I guess I'll say in response to that question, this is the idea of bad cops and accountability. To say a lot of the violence that people experience that produces legal estrangement is not the product of, quote, bad cops who would independently be held accountable. A lot of what happens in marginalized communities especially is perfectly legal. So I think about what happened with George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd. Everything preceding the murder was legal, right? So if you listen to the closing arguments, the prosecutor says, this case is about the 9 minutes and 29 seconds. It's not police on trial. It's not about anything that led up to it. It's not the police stopping George Floyd and pulling a gun on him and, threatening him in that way. All of that stuff happens every day and it's perfectly legal. And so so that's why I think that, the question assumes that the problem is bad cops, but I think it's more important to understand that the problem is deeply bad systems, both at a policy level, a legal level, or all at a policy level, a legal level, and a cultural level.
A question I have, Monica, is what is the value, I guess, and Walter, this goes to kind of your point too about the histories and the ability of communities to actually voice their needs. I guess the value of harm reduction in policing, when harm reduction so often means funding police departments more for trainings or body count, whatever it might be. Yeah.
I'll say a quick word. So first, we have to differentiate between different types of harm reduction in policing, I think. So, for example, there's been all this focus on Oakland recently because Oakland made this move to, quote, defund their police department, but also their fire services. It was all about austerity, actually. But they're like, we're defunding our police department. And, as in many places, because of the pandemic, crime has increased. And there's this like blame of defunding. And actually, I guess I lost my train of thought. I was like, this is a bit of a field, but I was going to connect it back to the question. But actually, I don't remember what was the question again?
Harm reduction.
Yeah. Right. So one of the things they defunded. So when they defunded the police, they defunded the police department, which also includes outreach workers to do violence interruption. So this is to say, they also defunded the alternative to policing, one of the alternatives to policing. Now, yeah, that technically falls under a police line item. So frankly, I think some of our talk about like, is it adding to the police budget or is it not, misses the way local budgeting sometimes works. And so this is all to say, I think we have to be, oh, that's funny. It was on NPR this morning, but like there is a place for harm reduction, and many people who are abolitionists embrace certain types of harm reduction. But we can't assume that all harm reduction is the same. And critically, and this is the last point I'll make, we have to think strategically over the long term about what our goals are. And a lot of the police reform debate, you try to like build coalitions and not talk about big goals very much, because people don't agree on those, but it's easier to get people to agree on particular sorts of incremental reforms. That means that once an incremental reform happens, everyone treats it as a victory. So it's like, oh, look at all, we've had 140 pieces of new state legislation since George Floyd was murdered. Isn't that a victory? But actually the goal is not that, right? The goal is not to have more body cameras on their own. Like no one would agree to that, I don't think. So that I think is what's key in a conversation about harm reduction. Is harm reduction toward what end is so important to take care and deal with the systems we have now. I really reject when people say, well, no harm reduction, or like, I know people are suffering right now, but we don't need to focus on that. No, we do need to focus on that, but just with an eye toward a bigger prize.
Let me unmute my mic. Is when we talk about harm reduction, it goes back to the point that I keep making, is that the people who need the most harm reduced often don't have the voice to speak up about how that's going to be done. And one of the things I always say, because I really struggle with this idea of reform, whether we're talking about police, whether we're talking about mass incarceration and criminal justice as a whole, because again, as we keep echoing the root, we're not agreeing about the root causes. And I think that's just, we're having a discussion about police, but in actuality, this is not really like a siloed issue. It's a multifaceted, different areas, different social areas, housing, education. It all ties in to the discussion that we're having. But Jesus, why do I keep losing? Give me 1 second. I don't know what's going on.
No worries.
I keep getting ahead. I'm having so many ideas come through, and it's like
that brilliant mind of yours.
But no. So all I'm trying to say is America's inability to have discussions around racism and its impacts and its origins have led to all the problems that we are seeing in different parts of society. Today, we're talking about policing. The reason that I struggle with reform so much is because without addressing the root cause, you're never going to get to you're never going to get to anything meaningful. And one of the things I always say is I'm glad my ancestors were not running around here trying to get policy and legislation passed talking about we need to reform slavery. We need to some things just have to be overhauled. Some things just we have to start over. We have to break it all the way down to the nuts and bolts, get everybody around the table and say, how do we do this? And I think that something as magnanimous, something as dynamic as that I believe it's the only way. It's the only way to build something where people still feel safe. People are not being harmed by the people who are supposed to keep them safe. And yeah.
No, thank you so much. I think what you powerfully articulated has been articulated also by a lot of the defund movement, the abolitionist movements, a lot of organizers that called to alternatives to policing. And I guess it would be helpful for us to discuss that. What is the significance of defund specifically, which is, unprecedented support now in the country? Is there a turning point there? Yeah.
I think a lot of what gets mistaken about defund the police is that a lot of people think that people are saying we should not have police. Like we should not have. Like people think that society as exists right now minus the police, and it's just like the common argument is that everybody, all the criminals are going to run free. There's not going to be nobody to stop them, when that's actually not the case at all. as I was alluding to earlier about, you know, the different disciplinary, the interdisciplinary and I'm struggling to find a word there. I'm talking about different areas though of society. By funding, by deflating the police budget and reallocating those funds to make sure that we provide adequate housing in every community, that we give people access to quality healthcare and education and childcare, that we invest in training programs and jobs, naturally, we're not going to have issues where we're not going to have the same levels of crime that we have. Naturally, if I'm in Princeton, if I'm in Princeton, New Jersey, and I happen to leave my wallet in a deli, there's a stronger chance that it's going to be there when I get back, as opposed to leaving it in Camden. And it's not because the people in Camden are thieves or they're just bad people. It's because of it's a poverty issue. And so when you talk about defunding the police, you're talking about so many different levels of addressing the root causes, getting closer to those root causes, as opposed to saying police are all bad, we don't need them at all.
Yeah, that's so important, and Walter, I thank you for that, like really trenchant analysis. I'll quickly mention a couple of other points. So one is that often people misunderstand the claims of the defund the police movement on multiple levels. Of course, the one that the whole point is about investing in alternatives, and I think alternatives is not the best language, but we're just going to go with that right now, because it's really investing in an entirely new way of thinking about how crime reduction happens, and also how accountability for harm happens. Now, this is really important. No one is saying that no one should be held accountable when harm happens, but there are so many other ways of doing that, some of which are long-standing, that but people's minds, have naturalized policing and the carceral system as the only ways that even the state could deal with harm, and that is simply untrue. So just if you want to look into resources, transformharm.org has a number of lists of transformative justice resources, ways that communities address harm of many different sorts, including violent harm, without using the carceral system. The other thing I just want to say, and because I feel like it might be kind of an elephant in the room with this crowd, is like, Melina, you were like, well, unprecedented support for defund the police. Kind of. I guess it is unprecedented, but also a lot of people who really hate either the actual mission of defund and abolition, or I think the more acceptable thing is to say that's totally impractical. It makes people in red states really upset, or actually just like moderates really upset. People even like, a congressman from my own home state, Jim Clyburn, claiming that defund the police caused losses of seats in South Carolina. Now, being from South Carolina, I know there's a lot more going on there than defund the police language, but okay. And I think some of this focus on the effect of defund the police on proximate electoral politics is just a complete misunderstanding of movement politics, which is to say the language of defund the police and the language of abolition aren't about seeing how it shows up on an opinion poll. By the way, I think if you've read it all about this, that if you poll Black people also don't say they want abolition right now. But defund the police and abolition are not majoritarian movements. The time horizon is different. It's more about galvanizing, educating, organizing. And this is the essence of what W.E.B. Du Bois and people like Angela Davis have called abolition democracy, which is it's fundamentally not about opinion polls or majoritarian governance, but is instead about education over a much longer time horizon. So that I think is also a really important way. There's one other quick thing I want to say with my eye on the time, which is to also think about the particular role the left flank that might be embodied by defund the police has played in reform. So as Walter was pointing out, Back, in the days when people were talking mostly about Ferguson, and also Eric Garner, et cetera, there was a run toward body cameras and all of this, like even people in the movement were kind of embracing a lot of what people say are non-reformist, or would say are reformist reforms, like more about legitimating the status quo. In the summer of 2020, in this new phase of focusing on defund, it's interesting because the politics change. So things that once seemed radical now seem moderate. So if you look locally at some of the changes that have happened, there are radical organizations in Durham, North Carolina, for example, that have been pushing to have the local government fund alternatives to policing. For years, they've been pushing and getting pushback from the city council and just like a lack of follow through. But when they started calling for defund in summer of 2020, city council got us together and said, okay, well, we're not going to do that budget cutting thing. Oh no, but we will do the thing that you've been asking for years, which is to at least put some funding into alternatives. And so we've seen some of that around the nation. And that is a really, really important practical policy change that the defund movement has created.
The last question, oh, sorry, go ahead, Walter.
Oh, no, I was going to just piggyback off of Monica. Yeah, I remember when Jim Clyburn, right after the election, he was, him and many other moderate Democrats were so frustrated with I guess, what they perceive as the left of the party. I don't believe it's truly left, but his words were, it was like an albatross around the neck of the Democrats and cost them seats. And I really, I think that, when we're talking about this idea of progress, that oftentimes just that old time thinking is also another roadblock to, a roadblock to really kind of accelerating some of these issues and getting them the time for discussion. As Monica said, this is more of an educational thing. You can use that soundbite to say, this is not what it means. This is not what people are saying, but there's this political component of it that always, it seems like that's where the struggle resides. That's where the struggle resides, is getting people to acknowledge that some things are just sound bites, some things are just good for, quick jabs, and other things have a much deeper meaning and will ultimately bring about a society that's more equitable and just for everyone, which is what the whole Democratic platform was, this election cycle. But speaking toward the shift, I think one of the things that I noticed recently that was indicative of the fact that, despite the pushback from even moderate, obviously you're going to get the pushback from the right, but even the pushback from moderate Democrats is even losing steam. When I look at places like Philadelphia and the election that just happened this week with the district attorney's office. For anybody who's local to PA, you saw the ads. There was a contested DA race between a guy named Larry Krasner, who's incumbent, not without his issues, but still a more progressive leaning district attorney. And then there was this fraternal order of police endorsed opposer, Carlos Vega, who, really just wants to, going back to the old tropes of, the tough on crime rhetoric, that we've seen over the last 30 years, which has led to where we are now. And to my surprise, I knew Krasner was going to win. I didn't know he would win by so much. And I think, for me, that was indicative of there is a shift happening in society. There's a moment happening, and I get frustrated when moderate Democrats won't even come to the table to hear what the left is talking about, or to really try to use those sound bites to educate people who might not even know, or might think that, you know, certain positions and platforms are too radical.
For our last question, I guess it'd be nice to know how you all think about what the end goal is. Walter, you were talking about, you know, changes of deeper meaning that bring us closer to equitable society. Monica, you know, the end of legal estrangement. What could that look like, and how do we get there?
Yeah, I'm gonna try to be brief, try to do a better job. So first, I think fundamentally, and this is where we started the conversation, and I'm sorry about the noise, I don't know what's going on. Actually, Walter, why don't you go ahead and answer, I'm gonna close my window.
It's such a tough question, Melina, to be honest, because, you
it's
know,
unfair. It's an unfair question.
I have been at this for close to a decade now. Actually, longer than a decade. Wow, time gets away from us. Longer than a decade, and it's so. I think it's more of. I think the answer to the question is one of the reasons it's difficult, because it's more of what you think society should ideally look like. And because we have so many different cultures and experiences, we don't really agree on what that should look like. But I think an end goal to this crisis in policing, like to an end goal, what it would look like is a society where education is free, education is a human right, healthcare is a human right, housing is a human right, and police exist to stop crime while it's happening. So I personally don't believe that there is a need for the majority of the things that police are assigned to do daily. I don't think that there's a need for traffic stops. I don't think there's a lot of patrols don't need to exist. I think that if there is a bank robbery in progress, or there's a hostage situation, those are instances where you need trained people with weapons to come in and intervene, de-escalate, and quell the situation. So in my society, in my ideal society, and in my vision of the end goal, people just have the things that they need. If people have the things that they need and they have the ability to exist and live life and thrive, the need for police dramatically reduces. I believe that in cases where people are having a moment in crises, that social workers and people who do mental health work are more equipped to address those than actual police. Maybe police can be there in the event of an emergency, but not to be the leaders in those situations. And I think that, yeah, I think that's I think the end goal will look like, you know, something to that effect.
Yeah, so I agree with that set of end goals. But I'll say this: we have to change our time horizon. So, you know, you policy people in the room, we have to change the time horizon on which we evaluate and think about goals and policy outcomes. This is really important because we're not going to realize the end goal, whatever it is, in a short, like, it's going to take generations, frankly, to work our way out of where we are, because it has taken us generations to arrive at this point. And I think that is a tough pill to swallow for lots of people like Truman scholars, where it's like, well, you know, I did this, I implemented this thing, and then like, you know, a month later, I was able to see its results in these ways. You know, we even think about that when evaluating applications. Did they show impact? A lot of this type of work is not going to show that sort of impact. And that's really important. There are a couple of things I want to kind of address the question in response to some of the questions in the chat, just keeping an eye on time. So and I think this really helps illuminate the part of the questions about like, how do we get there? How do we change the politics so that one day those end goals are possible? So first, you know, is it possible to move toward restorative justice framework? Scholastic, it's great to see you in policing and criminal justice. So I will say, like, I kind of had a follow-up question for the question. I'm not going to ask it, and I'll say instead, you know, in a lot of our current systems, so is it possible to say, okay, well, we're going to adopt a restorative framework now? There actually, so this police department in Colorado, the Longmont Police Department, that says it's doing restorative policing. There are two big issues. One, and I think a lot of people talk about this, it's hard to change the culture of policing from on high. This is what happened with community policing, which is like, it's like, okay, we're gonna do community policing now, we're gonna fund community policing efforts. And in most police departments, community policing doesn't fit well with the culture, right? Like it's hard to, it's like if people go into policing to like, you know, bash in the heads of criminals, that doesn't fit well with this kind of social worker model. And a similar type of issue plagues this idea of imposing restorative justice frameworks on pre-existing systems that don't accompany much deeper types of changes. So there's that sort of issue. The other is political, and that's a result of that. Sometimes cops, if they're tasked with doing restorative work, get devalued within their departments, right? So there's this sort of like, you know, nanifying or weird like feminizing of cops in a hyper masculine, you know, really kind of warrior type of environment. So it's actually hard. So it's easy, I think, to get people to think, oh, restorative justice is good. It's really, really hard at an implementation level because of these deep cultural and political dynamics within departments to see real change from there. Quickly to say a word about the like relationship between prison and incarceration, and this ties into Deborah's question about decarceration efforts. First of all, decarceral efforts are really, really important non-reformist reform, right? So this is to say, so yes, absolutely, this is important, but it's important, it's deeply related to policing, right? Which is to say that when you don't have the embrace of certain criminal laws or, you know, high sentences attached to criminal laws, whatever, that changes the work of policing on the front end. So the fact that you know, loose cigarette ordinances, if you think about Eric Garner, would be enforced through police. That's something actually police would use as a reason to engage. That is toxic at the front end of the system of policing. And so, so even though, I guess one other quick point, I know there's only a couple minutes. The police often, and basically various criminal system actors always point to other criminal systems actors as a reason that they can't make certain changes. So this is true of prosecutors. It's like, well, if I try to change what I'll prosecute, then the police are going to come after me. We saw this in St. Louis, actually, with Kim Gardner, the prosecutor there. The police advocated against her because she was trying to change the crimes that would be enforced. So this is all to say, there are lots of moving parts in this system. It's not right to think about the system as a whole comprehensive unit that is affected all by one thing. But we can see that there is a deep relationship between all of these different parts. So it's really hard to embrace a perspective that is abolitionist about one without being ultimately abolitionist about the others.
Thank you, Monica, so much for answering the questions in the chat as well. Walter, do you have anything to add, I guess, on the questions on the relationship to transformative justice, and then also the connection to the carceral state more broadly?
Not really. Not anything that Monica hasn't already said. I mean, to be honest, it's not. I don't have. I'm thinking about. I'm processing everything she said, and okay, she got that. Okay, nah.
Yeah. Well, we're nearly up with our time, and I don't see that there are any more questions, I guess, in the chat. Thank you both so much for this conversation, and thank you to you all for being here. This was really extraordinary.
Thank you all for doing this. Thanks for coming, and thanks so much, Melina and Walter, for joining me.
Yeah, thank you all again. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for having me. It was such a pleasure to be here. I learned a lot. I'm excited about the future. I'm excited about where we're going to go from here.
Well, thank you, Monica, Walter, Melina. It's always good to see you. It's always good to hear from you guys. Just really appreciate this important and really timely conversation. It is remarkable how much you guys covered in just 1 hour. And I know this is a conversation we're going to continue, and we need to continue. So thank you for the very work that you are doing, for so many of our Trumans are doing. And we know you guys are working collaboratively across years, across geographies, and just appreciate you. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. It's always great to see you guys. I can't wait until we can be together in person, but until then, it's great to stay connected like this from afar. Please watch your inboxes for an update from TSLW 2021 next week, which we're really excited about. And then also watch your inboxes for invitations to our June Speaking with Friends event shortly thereafter. So with that, we hope you'll continue joining us. It's great to see you guys. And with that, this concludes today's program. Bye, everyone. Take good care.